Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our second panel on battery electric transit, busing and hydrogen fuel cell here today. I don't know about you, but I was dancing around to the music in that sponsorship video. So thanks so much to Zev Clean Power and MTB Solutions. Welcome to battery electric bus and fuel cell electric bus transit operations, small to mid-size systems from 100 to 500 buses. With that, I'd like to welcome here to our panel today our speakers who are going to be sharing their expert insight with us about the good, the bad, the ugly, the highs and the lows of going electric when you're working with a system that's sized 100 to about 500 buses is your fleet. We have with us Lauren Skyver, CEO and General Manager of Sunline Transit, Cliff Thorne, Director, Maintenance and Motorist Services at Orange County Transit Authority, Blair Allen, Supervisor, Transit Development at Grand River Transit, and Doran Barnes, CEO of Foothill Transit. Thank you to all of you for joining. We really appreciate it. And thank you for working with us through this virtual platform. We're super excited to hear what you have to share with us. And I know that our colleagues on the line and the folks who are attending as attendees are looking to take away a lot of information in order to take it back to their own transit systems. So with that, we're going to kick things off right away with presentations by our panelists to set the scene and give a little bit of context before we move into Q&A from the audience and moderator. Lauren, I'm going to turn it over to you to kick things off.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for all of you. I'm going to talk a little bit about Sunline Transit Agency and our zero emission program. Sunline, can I get the next slide, please? Sunline's an early adopter. We started with a board policy in the early 90s, which directed the agency to look at zero emission technology and actually direct the CEO to continue movement towards zero emission fleet. We were one of the first to operate hydrogen fuel cell buses and actually build a station. And in 2006, we started producing with an SMR, steam methane reformer. She produced, and I call her a she. She's been a workhorse for a long time, almost 200 kilograms per day. And she's been in operation since 2006. We have just decommissioned this SMR, but I'll talk more about how we're producing fuel today. Next slide. So one of the things I want to talk to the group about is the new paradigm of fleet operations. And one of the things that we have to get used to as fleet operators in a zero emission world is a mixed propulsion fleet and maybe a mixed provider fleet. Sunline has a large subsection of vehicles that we operate. Our fuel cell fleet is mostly Eldorado Nationals and New Flyer, but as you can see underneath that, we also have a mix of and drive systems, which makes it seem complex, and it is complex, but it's absolutely something that our maintenance department has learned how to do, learned how to operate, and maintain these vehicles with multiple component and manufacturers. We also run 4 BYD all battery electric vehicles. One of the other points to make on this slide is a fuel cell bus is a battery or electric bus. It just uses a fuel cell as the range extender. Next slide. So how do we make fuel today? As I mentioned before, we had been using SMR, so we used renewable biogas, compressed natural gas, steam methane reformation to create that hydrogen. But SMR on a fleet size is difficult when you need to get into higher fuel capacities. And so we now have the largest producing, and Cliff will talk a little bit more about a larger station, but this is the largest production station in North America for a transit fleet. It produces 900 kilograms of hydrogen per day. We use an electrolyzer for that power. We do use grid power today, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're going to make this station renewable. The station was provided by a CARB versus board grant, and the station was about $8.7 million for its creation. We came in a little bit under that, and we've used that to create more storage for this gaseous fuel we use in our vehicles. Next slide. So what are we doing for the future? I talked a little bit about making our fleet more renewable. So there's zero emission at the tailpipe, and there's truly renewable from well to wheel. And Sunline is driving on the next future of that with the solar microgrid. We've bought property across the street. You can see it in that schematic. Phase 1 of this process will be putting a solar farm with about 4 megs of solar to provide power for our electrolyzer. That way we are no longer buying grid power, and it'll drop our kilogram price probably to under $4 per kilogram once we get this solar grid moving forward. The next will be battery storage, so we can store the solar power to run the electrolyzer and our fuel station during off daylight times. The third phase will be to create a public and a truck station. And then the fourth stage will be to have an actual travel plaza where clean trucks that need to produce or need to buy hydrogen or clean electricity can use the station on their way into the LA basin. Next slide. So here you can kind of see what this will all look like. It's kind of small, but you see the solar farm across the street. The small little box above the building is the electrolyzer. We'll be putting in compression and battery storage to run all of this equipment, and this will be a completely solar microgrid that is used to produce hydrogen. We do have the money for the land and the solar farm. We have several projects in right now to do the next two phases of this project. Next slide. So what are challenges for ZEBs? I think that all transit, whether it's moving to a new propulsion system or moving into a new redesign, is challenging. There are challenges for starting a ZEB program, and the first thing I would talk about is making sure that you have some kind of policy, or whatever your overarching governance is aware of the program and the end game that the organization is reaching for. So getting some board approval, getting a policy, no matter what your governance structure is, communicating with electeds about why and where you're going is really important. Resiliency and redundant power. We're driving on some resiliency and redundant projects right now, but even as an organization that's way ahead, we still have to move forward. And I'll leave the rest of these challenges to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was really helpful. And I know we squished you into 5 minutes. Going forward, we're looking forward to learning even more about the training center, which is extremely innovative for a transit system, especially one your size. So we're going to try and flesh that out in the Q&A. Next, we're going to turn to Cliff in Orange County, where the sun shines bright. And I had the chance to be just not too long ago talking to you and your team about the modeling of the electric buses in your fleet. So over to you, Cliff.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Cliff Thorne. I'm the Director of Maintenance and Motorist Services at the Orange County Transportation Authority. Today, I'm going to share a little bit about our hydrogen fuel cell electric bus pilot. Before we do that, I'd like to give you a little background on Orange County, on OCT in general. OCT is located in Orange, California. Now, I say that because I understand there's an Orange in Florida, so people always think I'm coming from Florida, but we are actually in California, and we're very close to Sunline Transit, which we have been very fortunate to learn much from them. But we serve 34 cities, and we have 3.1 million residents. The OCT service area is quite unique in that we don't have a single downtown, so with a central point, but rather we have smaller points of interest. You're most familiar with Disneyland and some of those other theme parks and the beaches. So we're pretty spread out, and as a result, many of our buses will need to operate more than 300 miles per day. So that's important when we're trying to decide what kind of a zero-emission technology we'll be deploying in the future. We currently have over 1,300 employees, and we operate on a fiscal budget of $1.5 million. We are responsible for planning and providing coordinated and effective public transportation within Orange County. You can see here a list of some of the services that we do. I won't go into each one of them, but I think it's important to state that 39% of our budget is focused on bus service. And that's important to note because when we transition over to a zero-emission bus program, it's going to be a very large part of our operating profile. And we currently have 37.5 million annual passenger boardings and 1.6 million revenue vehicle miles. We're also in the picture there, you can see a streetcar, and I put coming soon because we're under construction right now, and I consider that a zero emission effort. But we are running a streetcar in our busiest corridor that will go into service beginning in 2022. And let's see, here we go. So now about our hydrogen fuel cell pilot program. This was really an effort to meet the California Air Resources Board mandate to transition to zero-emission buses by 2040. The OCTA started testing zero-emission buses with the introduction of these 10 hydrogen fuel cell electric buses. The buses have gone into service as of February of this year, and it includes the 10 buses. These buses meet all of OCTA's operational requirements. As I said a moment ago, our buses do travel up to and sometimes beyond 300 miles, so it's important for us to have a bus that can meet that range requirement. The refueling is 6 to 10 minutes, so that's about the same as what we do with our CNG buses. So it fits our operational profile as well. We also have a fuel station, and as Lauren alluded to, as far as we know, it's the largest hydrogen fuel cell station in the country, in North America. We currently only have the 10 buses, but we have the capacity to do up to 50 buses per day. And it is scalable to, this configuration is scalable to 100 buses with just simply adding additional fuel storage. Right, so as I said, our goal is 100% zero emission fleet by 2040. We're doing 2 pilots right now. As I mentioned, we have the hydrogen fuel cell bus pilot, but we're also procuring 10 battery electric buses, which are coming soon. We're currently in procurement now, choosing the vendor. With these 2 zero emission bus types, we'll be able to get a better understanding of what the fleet mix will be for Orange County service. As I told you, we have 300 mile range buses. Less than 20% of our service is under 150 miles. So coming up with the right fleet mix is going to be important for us. As far as challenges, of course, funding is the biggest challenge. These hydrogen fuel cell buses cost 1.3 million each. The fuel station was about 5 million. So these are much greater costs than what we're experiencing today. If you want to talk about good, bad, and ugly, the good is that the 300 mile range really helps us to meet our operational need. The bad is that fuel availability is not very common. So when we were first testing a bus and we had no fuel station, we were going to light duty stations, and of course, as the light duty vehicles became more popular, the fuel stations didn't want us using up all the fuel. So it's important to have your own fuel station. So that's a big deal if you're going to go into 10 or more buses. And with that, the ugly would be the cost of hydrogen fuel. Now we expect that to come down and be more reasonable in the next 5 or 10 years. But for now, the cost is very high compared to CNG and electricity. So with that, I'm looking forward to answering any of the questions that come up later. Thank you.
Perfect timing. Thanks so much, Cliff. And I think we're all really excited to see and learn from a bus project in one fleet that has 10 battery electric and 10 fuel cell buses. That's going to just be a rich treasure trove of data that a lot of agencies can learn from. And for folks who are on the line, when he said 1.3 million, of course, that's American. So in today's exchange, it's about 1.7, 1.8 Canadian, depending on where that is. That's quite an expensive vehicle to put those thoughts into perspective. So with that, I'm going to turn over to our colleague, Blair Allen, who, if you're in Canada, you'll know is from Grand River Transit. And if you're not familiar with that, it's in the city of Waterloo, which if you're international joining us today from around international boundaries and borders, then you will know it is the home of BlackBerry, one of which I still have because we do that here in Canada. So Blair, over to you from Waterloo.
Good afternoon, or I guess good morning for some people. Thanks for an opportunity to speak here, and it's an exciting time for us and the changes that we're doing at Grand River Transit right now. And I guess I'm the Ontario, Canada representative versus the Ontario, California rep, where most of the other speakers are from today. So just as a brief outline, the region of Waterloo, Grand River Transit serves the region of Waterloo. We were formed in 2000 as an amalgamation of some other lower level transit properties. And there's about 600,000 population in our area. We are about an hour west of Toronto, just to give a reference point for people who will probably know that more so than us. after beating the California team in the NBA last year. So we like that. Anyways, we've got 3 cities and 4 which are very urban, and then 3 rural townships around the edges of it. And we're at the end of a corridor, it's called the sort of a high technology corridor that we've got between Toronto and Waterloo region that is very high tech. BlackBerry was an original or big companies, but now is split into many, many other companies as things have changed in the area. So Grand River Transit, as we said, formed in 2000. We now have a network with the biggest change for us was last year we introduced a light rail line, 19-kilometer long line going at this point, between Kitchener and Waterloo, with eventually hopefully extending down to our third city of Cambridge. The designs are in the works for that now. Currently, we have 264 diesel buses, 12 hybrids, and then 14 light rail vehicles, which we consider already are sort of low emission because they are electric vehicles already. And we also have 6 contracted vehicles, smaller 25-foot vehicles that we have for some of our routes that are more on-demand type services. And then we also have a paired transit service, which we're looking at, but at this point is sort of separate to most of my discussion today. So we've got 3 garages. One of them is exclusive to the light rail vehicles, and then one is under construction, which is a key to what I'm going to be talking about today. Our ridership, we went up to 22 million last year with a fairly aggressive target to attain about 54 million by 2031 as part of a places to grow strategy for the province and part of our ridership growth. With obviously this year we will see some changes, but we hope to pick that back up because we think the fundamentals are strong. And about 100,000 boardings on weekdays this year before the COVID crisis hit, which did, like everybody else, is shrunk for now. We are starting to see that pick up a bit. So the key right now that we have is what we're doing with electric buses is, unlike the other properties speaking today, we are new to the field. It was less than a month ago that we actually got our council approval to move forward with a electric bus strategy and a sort of a energy friendly strategy to start looking at new approaches to the use of energies to meet some of the goals that we've got long term for the region. So the key one is the electrification pilot that we're doing. We got approval to purchase 11 battery electric buses that we would start. We would have 5 in 2022 and then 6 the following year. And our timing for that is centered around a new garage that we're building right now. It's about $104 million facility, can handle 200 to 250 buses, depending on the sizes of them. And as a new garage, it had pre-designs for electrification, but at this point we now have to start designing to actually handle the electric buses and putting in the infrastructure for that. Finally, the other element of it is hybrid buses that we have, and we want to, the part of the other strategy that was approved by our council is to no longer purchase diesel-only buses, but use any of the buses in a transition period to zero-emission buses, to go to low-emission vehicles, and only purchase hybrid buses starting next year. So the challenges we have is as some have heard, that many of the Canadian properties, we have an 80% reduction by 2050 target. Our council is actually, in our sessions that we had, they spent 2 hours talking about the policy at a report, and they want us in some ways to go faster. So part of our challenge is to balance the expectations with what is realistic for us to do. Finally, with it, you can see that we've got a lot of growth. We're trying to utilize this new expansion that's going on, our new facilities and that, but at the same time, financially is a challenge, and we've got to balance the costs that we have as we want to expand properly, but also be able, new technologies obviously higher costs in the short run. We see as a long term, that's what we want to aim towards, and just how can we balance all those demands. Thank you for this.
Thank you so much, Blair. We really appreciate that. And I think everybody sees Waterloo as the hub of innovation. So with LRT and hybrids and so on, everybody's really quite waiting for this city to be representative of innovation in the country. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned from Orange County, from Sunline, for similarly sized fleets. And with that, we're going to head over to Foothill Transit, which lots of folks talk about. I think every time I go to a conference, somebody says something about Foothill Transit, what they've learned in the data there. So I'm going to move over to Doran Barnes, CEO of Foothill Transit. Over to you, Doran.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you. And, I always find these events to be so fascinating. I always learn things. And I think the exchange of information, the rapid evolution is so critical. So it's great to be able to share a bit of our story. Just to give you some geographic bearing, Foothill Transit is in eastern Los Angeles County, suburban Los Angeles County. We provide service to 22 cities in eastern Los Angeles County and connecting express service into downtown Los Angeles. We actually connect with Cliff service at OCTA on our southern boundary, and we're about 75 miles roughly to the west of Lauren and Sunline Transit. And we certainly all share lots of information. We're watching, and I'll tell you more about it, but we're watching, Cliff, what you're doing very closely to pick up the lessons learned. And we've spent some really great time with Lauren and her team sharing ideas and learning from each other. So lots of good things here. We are a mid-size operator running a fleet of roughly 380 buses. In our overall fleet. Our fleet is primarily compressed natural gas powered, although we do have 33 electric buses in our fleet, and I'll tell you more about that. So we, I think, fit right in the middle of this mid-size range. I think we're generally big enough to be able to do things that are interesting and creative, but small enough to be able to really focus on this particular program. And I think that's proven to be a valuable mix for us overall. We actually have a couple of different experiences with zero-emission vehicles, and we started in 2010 as the very first operator of heavy-duty fast-charge electric transit vehicles powering off of the grid. So unlike our colleagues that are focused, OCTA and Sunline, kind of primarily focused on fuel cell, but also looking at grid power, we've kind of gone the other route. We started with grid power, and I really have experienced both the opportunities and challenges with grid power. Our first application was a local route that connected a number of destinations in the cities of Pomona and Laverne, two of our cities. The unique features of this initial application is that the buses have a relatively short range, 30 to 40 miles maximum range. So if you think about a typical service day, nowhere near enough range to be able to get through a typical service day. But the vehicles charge very quickly. We can actually go from, we can actually fully charge the vehicles in less than 10 minutes, and our average charge time is about a little over 5 minutes charge time on this particular technology. We have a charger that's located at the center of the route, which is where we have a transit center. So we're able to have two charge heads there. The buses essentially come in, and about every 2 hours, they take a 5-minute period, they charge up, and they continue. So in theory, this vehicle could run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and never really go off route because it's constantly charging throughout the day. And that's the real key feature with this particular technology. What we found with the technology itself is that it's been quite robust. It's been quite reliable. We've had to do some schedule modifications to accommodate for that charging period, but the technology works well. The challenge that we found is that because we're charging every 2 hours, variations in electric pricing really come into play in terms of the economics. So when we're charging at 6 a.m. in April, it's not a big deal. When we're charging at 6 p.m. in August, when temperatures here are incredibly hot, electric prices are high, and that has a great bearing on cost. So that's one of the things that you really have to factor in. You also have to take into account the limitations in terms of range to make sure that you can hit that charge window using this particular type of technology.
Mm-hmm. And Doran, I know you've still got quite a bit, but I want to let you know we've got about 1 minute left, and
Okay.
so I don't want to rush you, but I kind of want to rush you.
I'll keep going here. I'm going to skip this slide. The second technology that we have is an extended range technology, and that's where we're able to run the buses a longer period of time. That range is about a 190-mile range. And the key there has been, again, being able to get through the full service day, being able to charge those vehicles overnight. It all comes down to that combination of cost, of infrastructure. How do you put together a program that ultimately makes sense with lots of variables? What we're now moving towards is following Lauren and Cliff in looking at fuel cell technology. And I always learn things in these panels. And Lauren, you said something that I thought really hit home, which is this notion of being comfortable with a mixed fleet. And I think that's something that we've definitely had to get used to, is being comfortable with the mixed fleet, doing short range vehicles, long range vehicles, fuel cell vehicles. And I think the ultimate solution is going to be a combination of all of those technologies that get to where we ultimately need to be. So some thoughts in terms of recommendations: start small, expect the unexpected. You'll learn things that you don't even know you're going to learn. Be prepared for that. And electric power infrastructure is the key, whether that's the grid powered infrastructure or the fuel cell infrastructure that's needed. So I'm going to finish on this slide, which is a bus that's going to be arriving here in a couple of months. This will be a grid powered double deck bus that we'll be putting into service, again, further expanding the variety of vehicles that are in our fleet.
That's fantastic. And what a great segue, Doran, into exactly what we're here to discuss, which is what is the nimbleness and the ability of smaller transit systems to be maybe even more flexible than larger transit systems. And earlier this morning, we had a session with TTC, Edmonton Transit, TransLink, large systems at play, York Region Transit in that mid-size zone. But nonetheless, those are three of Canada's largest systems. And, we would think that they would always be the most innovative, and they've certainly been out the door with really innovative deployments. But sometimes the ability to think about mixed fleets or mixed infrastructure is not as easy. There's a lot more infrastructure to leverage. There's a bigger fleet to have to deal with. There's more politics, frankly, to have to work through. So looking at the size of systems your own, given what you've said, and Blair, you're in the planning stage, but the others are in a bit of a deployment stage. The first question up for all of you is essentially, what would you do differently? Knowing now what you know, what would you do differently? And I'll ask you to preface that by saying, if you had to focus on one single thing that is the greatest benefit of what you've seen with your electrics or your hydrogen fuel cells, what's the one single biggest thing you'd say to any agency that's still reticent? But then can you buttress it by saying, what would you do differently? If you could rewind the clock and restart, what is that one thing that you wish you knew back then that you do know now? And Lauren, we're going to start with you because you've got a lot of lessons learned. And so what's the great things that have come out? And what's the one thing you'd really want to redo? Oh, sorry, 1 second, Lauren. We just got you muted. There you go.
One thing I would do, I think on our station, we had to be very creative and actually have to do a lot of work to help our contractor understand working in the US and working on a project that was so construction heavy. So I think we would have done, and I had it on my slide, a little bit more work on the team, understanding their understanding of the project and how to work in the desert, how to work in the US. And because we had a lot of start and stops and some tense moments based on that fact, just getting the project team more familiar with what the conditions they would be working under for any major grid or infrastructure project.
I think that's a really nice way to put it. A lovely poetic way to say it is tense moments. We've been part of some large integration deployments, and tense is a lovely way to put it. I think if you've been involved in something like this, tense is probably the best way you could define what's going on in the back end. As a segue to that, maybe Doran, I saw you nodding your head. What would be, the greatest thing that's come out of this, but then the thing you would do differently if you could rewind it all?
Yeah, I think, probably the biggest lesson we've learned, and if we could rewind the tape, we initially started with a lot of focus on the vehicle, the vehicle propulsion system, the technology around the vehicle itself. What we really found is that the critical path element is the fueling infrastructure, particularly if you're looking at a grid-powered technology, which is where we started. The complexity and the challenges of getting that infrastructure in place, you just can't underestimate that. And we've had some significant delays where we've had great sparkly, shiny, beautiful vehicles sitting in the lot that we don't have the infrastructure in place to be able to fuel. So that's probably our biggest lesson. I think in terms of some of the greatest benefits, certainly environmental benefit, but I think the other part of it is um, this program has really helped ingrain a spirit of innovation and creativity with our team and reinforce that. And that applies not only to our zero emission program, but really everything that we do. And that's certainly been very valuable.
Very helpful. And I think that march towards the low carbon economy means we need to get graduates coming out of school saying, I want to work for transit. And there's a lot of sex appeal to be had around zero carbon, zero emissions, automated busing systems in a way that just diesel or compressed natural gas didn't carry in the past from the perspective of an innovative, technologically oriented graduate. And with that, Cliff, we'll turn to you because, Orange County has been at the forefront of really innovative thought processes, learned a lot of data. So if you could rewind the clock, what would you do differently, or perhaps what have you learned that has led you to do things differently going forward? Oh, 1 second, Cliff, you're just muted.
Okay.
There you go.
All right.
There,
I think that actually OCTA, we've been very fortunate to have partners like Lauren over at Sunline and also AC Transit that were years ahead of us. So we learned a lot from both of those agencies, and we really see them as our mentors. When we take the next step, we make sure to talk to them. So, I think that there may be some things that I would want to do differently. For instance, the fuel station, the configuration, the smallest part of the whole operation you think is when they deliver the liquid hydrogen. Well, the way they offload it is counterproductive to our operation. So that one little part, it causes a lot of coordination, a lot of a kind of grief and blocking off of lanes and things like that. So I think that it's very important to look at the configuration of where you're going to put your fuel station, the traffic flow, and when do you expect fuel deliveries. But for the most part, we've been very fortunate. We had one bus that we ran for 2 years. It was a demonstration project. And that's what I was talking about earlier, that it was very difficult to get fuel for that. So we had to partner with a local college that had a fuel station. But once that 2-year agreement was up, you can't fuel here anymore. We were out of options. So my advice to anyone, if you're going to operate without building your own fuel station, was to get a good fueling station partner. In fact, we even took a couple of times, or maybe more than a couple of times, we towed a bus to Sunline Transit to get fuel, which is quite a drive. And that was during the testing of the buses. But it's very important to have that infrastructure lined up before you purchase the bus, and make sure you have a good solid agreement for a long period of time that while you're going to be operating that vehicle, as long as you don't have a station. Otherwise, you're going to have to buy a fuel station, or you can do like a temporary truck mounted station.
Mm-hmm. And I think, Cliff, you reiterate and sort of underscore what Lauren's referred to in the past, and also on this panel, and Doran just referred to it as well. We often hear a lot of transit agencies still, and certainly years ago, focusing on the bus, the vehicle, but really at the end of the day, it is about the charging and fueling system that you have in mind, and the charging or fueling strategy that you have in mind that's going to drive the applicability, the reliance, and the deliverables of your buses, right? So thinking that through from a systems planning perspective, and that's hard to do. And so, heading over to Waterloo, Blair, your team's at an earlier stage, and we typically find that once an agency does some modeling, it tends to change their perspective about what the strategy is going forward for electrification. And usually it comes off the bus and starts looking at the charging or fueling infrastructure as a primary variable. So can you let us know also, having gone through that modeling, but not yet have the electric buses out the door or the fuel cell buses, what is something that's led you to think differently going forward?
Yeah, I think it is and again, like the others, the infrastructure is a big element. And for us with the garage, we planned it thinking about electrics. We were sort of fortunate with that element. But I think we would have, if I had known, and now what we did a couple of years ago could have done that, we would have put it right into the system. The thing that we're still learning about, though, is, as you said, and we're still having to really grapple with this a bit, is our emphasis was on in-depot charging as the only approach, rather than looking at anything on road and so on. And just knowing the range and the length of our bus routes and so on, and the modeling that CUTRIC did for us in the working of that is we are going to have to look at how can we best adapt that strategy, and do we need to do something differently, or what is our best approach? We assume that battery ranges and so on will increase over time, but they'll only go up so much compared to what we can do in the short run. So it's just balancing that. And I think in the next year, we're going to spend a lot of time figuring out beyond the infrastructure in the garage is figuring out what is the best approach that we need to do. And anyone who's starting now, I would say, make sure that you design that electric stuff right in the capacity right into the garage from day one, rather than just thinking it might be a good idea.
Yeah, and so that actually, Blair, points to the fact that we're beyond the stage of one or two bus pilots. We're well into the stage of being able to glean from each other enough data to design facilities and fleet deployments at a much more robust level, even before you have your first bus in your fleet. And so what I'm going to do now is turn to questions from the audience. We've got a lot of them coming in, so I'm going to ask folks if you can answer them in about 60 seconds to the extent that you can. The first one takes us to a higher level philosophically with the COVID crisis, the economic impact on cities and regionality. What level is both ridership has been affected and also investments in the low carbon economy. And so the question coming from John Ulakovich, specifically, Blair, to yourself in Waterloo, is great to see ridership increasing. You know, what's driving that? But if I can philosophize that question more generally for all of you, ridership has radically dropped off due to COVID. Revenues have dropped off with that. What is the bounce back? What's it going to look like? How are you going to go green, given that your city has no cash? And are your existing drivers for ridership increase still going to come back and help you out here? So if you had ridership increasing before COVID, do you see those variables helping you out post-COVID? So with that, I'm going to start in reverse, and Blair, start with you because you had the good story about ridership and COVID's thrown a wrench into that.
Yeah, it's going to be a challenge, I think, for all of us, because the uncertainty even about how it's going to come back. So things like work from home, for many of us, that was a course that we had. We built a LRT line that connected a whole bunch of high-tech businesses and offices with a lot of new residential condo growth, and with the universities even that we don't have in class right now. And even a company like Shopify, which has a major several hundred employees in town, has announced they're going to go all work from home. How that's going to impact us, still going to be a challenge. I think we got the fundamental designs of our system in good shape. And I think if we're going to, as we're going to bounce back, it may take a bit longer than we anticipated before. The element is in terms of sort of the green economy or the green elements of it and low emissions, there's an argument being that if you're going to have to do some stimulus to help even the economy, and we all have to buy new buses because every year you got to buy some. And if we are expanding our fleet, we're going to want to buy them. For the bit more that we would have, I think our argument would be is let's make sure we buy the proper things that are beneficial for the long run. Because if anything, I think this is shown with the way the air is cleaned up over the last few months, that there is an impact of the way we've been driving around and the impact. So if we're going to build our buses, let's get the right buses in and use that as a stimulus package to do the right types of new buildings of our system.
Yeah, and I see there, Doran, you nodding along. I mean, to be honest, I run around in downtown Toronto. I'm pretty sure I blacken my lungs every time I do that. And so clean air is great, but it's still not necessarily even post-COVID going to be the case that occurs, if not more people going back into their cars. So Doran, insight into how's COVID going to impact the revenues and what's the future of going green in your system given this?
Well, I think a couple of things. First of all, California still has a mandate. So in some respects, we're a mandate to move forward. But beyond that, I think we really have to continue to work together to figure out how to make our fleet zero emission and cost effective. And I think it's conversations like this where we're still learning. But as Cliff mentioned, the cost of hydrogen is still pretty high. The cost of hydrogen needs to come down. The ability to work with grid-powered vehicles really needs to still be perfected. And I think by leaning in on that, by learning from each other, we can move that along. I also think from a broader standpoint, the whole COVID situation and changes in work patterns really require us all to think a bit differently about what we do and about our role. the issue of clean air. If we can get more people to telework, which is counter to having people ride transit, but very impactful from an environmental standpoint. So all of these things factored together, it's going to be interesting to see how it all sorts out.
So if the goal is emissions reduction, then people teleworking is not necessarily the evil. It's necessarily a solution along with transit in the climate fight.
Absolutely. I think that as transit operators, we really should be embracing the concept of teleworking. What we're talking a lot about at our agency is encouraging people to telework part of the time and encourage people to use zero emission public transportation when they do need to travel. Think about both the environmental impact and the infrastructure impact, positive infrastructure impact that could have.
Yeah. And with that, I saw you nod, Lawrence, over to you on this particular point.
Well, I want to bring a message of positivity. I mean, there is a lot of negativity with this pandemic, but as an agency, you need to keep this level of positivity. We're going to embark on a total redesign. This would have taken 3 years before the pandemic. We're now going to launch it in the next 6 months. That's a positive step to rebuilding our ridership. Like Waterloo, Sunline was seeing an increase in transit that was very much interrupted by COVID-19. But now we're going to introduce all of our redesign elements in January, which we would have done over a 3-year period. And on the zero emission front, this is the best time to build something. If you have a grant or money to do it, getting contractors out to our property, getting people to work. And the question on drivers, people need jobs. Our drivers are coming to work every day. We get more applications now than we ever have for drivers. And so I think if we can, as agencies, concentrate on the positive sort of aspects of this very negative worldwide incident, that's what transit does. We've always been the ones to resurrect and be the phoenixes of continuing to provide mobility, and we're going to continue to do that after this crisis.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, Lauren, in Canada, we've got about 50,000 people working in transit. Why is it not 500,000 or 1 million? Transit could actually be a vacuum that hoovers up people who lose their job in the transition to green or in the transition out of a COVID pandemic, give them good paying jobs in a great industry. Cliff, last thoughts on this issue of COVID-19 budget constraints and the future positivity of transit being able to innovate faster now than possibly ever before because of the disruption?
Yeah, well, in terms of OCTA, our 2 projects are funded, so short term will be okay. But I definitely see this COVID-19 pandemic as a temporary situation. Transitioning to a zero emission bus fleet is a permanent and more long term solution. So years from now, when this is behind us, we're still going to be on track to transitioning our fleets to zero emission, and people still need to move from place to place, even if telecommuting continues to grow.
All right, so I'm going to go now into a bit more technical questions coming from folks on the line. One is from Aaron Cook at the City of Winnipeg and Winnipeg Transit. And the question is specifically around the scaling costs of infrastructure. So Lauren, perhaps you can reference this. Also, Cliff, yourself, Doran, you probably have some insights here. When you take a look at the infrastructure costs specifically, how do the infrastructure costs of hydrogen versus battery electric buses and their charging infrastructure compare as your fleet size grows and as you scale up? What's your experience? Because we've all seen the curves at conferences as to which one maxes out. What is your experience on the ground? Lauren, we'll start with you. Oh,
muted. For us, we did do a study and we found that both property size and power generation, hydrogen was the best way, the lower cost infrastructure for us to move towards. And that, that is specifically to your industry. I think Blair talked a lot about doing a study. So unleash those folks in your organization that love science. You wouldn't believe who you're sitting next to who loves and would love to work on a project to actually dive into what is the best solution for your organization. Start asking these questions in meetings, start talking about it. But I think for us, we looked at buying power for a all electric battery operation, and we were already invested in hydrogen. The one thing I want to say about hydrogen that hasn't been said is that none of our operations have really changed from our compressed natural gas fleet. We don't have to charge buses. We don't have to make sure the plug is plugged in. They fuel exactly like our CNG buses. So from a employee, sort of the way we do business at night with cleaning and fueling, nothing changes. That doesn't mean to say that hydrogen is the best option for you, but it is one of the things that made it is just that much you to move our hydrogen program, and we will be 100% with a small fleet of battery electric, but we plan to have at least 80 hydrogen fuel cell buses by 2035.
Canada, we don't have that many systems that have compressed natural gas right now, like BC Transit, Calgary, Hamilton, whereas in California, almost everybody has natural gas pretty much. And so that transition to hydrogen is just a lot more easy because that knowledge and that thinking is there already, and the standards and facility design. Doran, did you want to jump in on this point, the scaling and the cost of scaling from hydrogen versus battery electric?
Yeah, well, a couple things. We've also done extensive studies and modeling. On our website, we have posted a pretty extensive engineering study that was done looking at grid power versus CNG versus hydrogen fuel cell. And I think in having worked in this space and around this space really most of my career, there are gobs and gobs and gobs and gobs of assumptions that have to go into these things. And I think we all, everybody that's worked in this space to some extent from time to time can bring a perspective that can drive you towards an outcome. It's really important to dive deep on all of the aspects, the financial aspects, the operational aspects, the land constraints. Lauren's got land to work with that I don't have. So that leads to different conclusions from a location by location standpoint. And to some extent, get that small scale experience that then you can grow into something bigger. It all adds complexity, and you really have to look at the puts and takes on the various technologies.
A petroleum molecule holds a lot of energy, as we all know, and as a result of that, we've been able to be wasteful in transit, transportation, housing, manufacturing, consumption as consumers, because it's cheap and it's high energy density. And as we move to zero carbon transit systems and transportation, we just can't waste because the electron and the hydrogen molecule are not as energy dense. And so as a result, really exactly what you said, Doran, gobs of assumptions go into your best guess, and therefore trying to figure out whether your best guess is reasonable. And on that point, Cliff, you've got some real life empirical knowledge. Fuel cell bus and now some battery electric buses head on head. What is the scalability cost from your perspective? Going electric, going hydrogen, where do you see the cost going up faster or slower or equivalently?
Well, I have to 100% agree with Lauren that the hydrogen infrastructure is much cheaper. So I think that when a lot of transit agencies are buying one or two buses and testing it, it's very easy to implement a battery electric bus because you essentially plug it in, right? But when you start to scale it out, you start really seeing that the grid and the utility requirements for that are very great, and that's when the price starts to go up. And people are always surprised. In fact, I had a conversation with someone at King County Transit yesterday. They were surprised that we only spent $5 million on a station that'll do 50 buses. If you were trying to do the same 50 buses on electric grid, it might be much different, with the charging and the upgrading of your infrastructure. And of course, the timing of when you charge those vehicles. You may have to set aside 4, 6, 8 hours to charge them. When the hydrogen has the same characteristics as CNG, you pull in the station, fill it up, park it, and you're ready to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lauren, I'm going to move to another question that's specific for you, although other folks may have some insight here. With regards to steam methane reformation, there are some questions from folks on the line about the cost, and you already identified some of the costs and the issues. And we've often heard that steam methane reformed hydrogen is cheaper than electrolyzed hydrogen. In certain jurisdictions in Canada, that's currently the case given the volume, but that may or may not be the case in the long term. And you mentioned due to volume constraints that SMR was actually quite expensive. Could you flesh that out a little bit and clarify?
The problem with SMR.
Oh, go ahead, Lauren. Go ahead.
I was going to say this problem with SMR is you either have small scale or huge scale industrial production. And so that middle of the road for either a mid-size, large, or even a small transit agency, once you get past 5 buses, becomes very expensive. We did look at SMR because we had source fuel that was renewable. We really wanted to stay with SMR for the credits and for the other benefits. You just can't find right now the technology at a cost point that makes any kind of sense. We would have had to strap 12 SMRs about the size of the one we have in order to produce 900 kilograms. So I think that SMR has a long way to go. One thing I did want to say to the group, I've just been sitting on this, is if you are trying to pencil out diesel buses as a cost driver between that and a zero emission bus, it will not pencil out. And so you cannot use that as your metric for deciding what is most beneficial. They do not pencil out now, and it'll be many, many years before they do.
Mm-hmm. So the key thing there being is a triple bottom line success factor. If we're dragging our feet on abandoning diesel, well, we're living in the 20th century and we're here in the 21st. So welcome to the new world, essentially. On that, then, I do want to follow up on not just the SMR, but hydrogen in general. There's several questions coming in from the audience saying, well, look, but what's the carbon dioxide equivalent? One of the reasons that people are looking at battery electric is if you live in British Columbia, or you live in Quebec, or you live in Manitoba or in Ontario, it's pretty much zero emissions. It's hydro, wind and solar, and then in Ontario, there's nuclear as well. And that's pretty much zero emissions from an air pollution standpoint. Whereas when you go to hydrogen, if there's an electricity process that drives the electrolysis, it's less efficient is often the issue that people identify as being less energy efficient than compared to SMR. There's just more carbon produced because there's a carbon dioxide footprint. So do you have a sense from your agencies what the carbon dioxide or the emissions equivalent is, or what you're seeing in your community? How many units of hydrogen do you get for the units of carbon dioxide or pollution that is produced? And Lauren, did you want to start? And then possibly Dorian, Cliff, you may have some insights here.
I think that that's a good point. I think that sometimes, though, we forget about what's needed to create lithium batteries and issues with the environment that they create. I think, though, it's like Doran's heard this before, and we say it a lot. If you've seen one transit agency, you've seen one transit agency. And so when you look at either the production type or method, I mean, I agree with what the people answering the questions are. That's why we're driving towards, our hydrogen in a way that's fossil fuel based is not the goal. And we are not going to operate that way. I mean, unfortunately, for about 8 months to a year, we're going to have to use grid power to produce our hydrogen. We knew that, but that's the way transit gets money, right? Our grants don't all come in at once for us to move our projects forward. But I think that your agency has to have a spirit of what the end goal is. And I think Doran, Cliff, and Blair have talked about this. You need to know what is the end game in order to drive the projects in the middle to get there. So, we are driving to having completely renewable hydrogen, and we most definitely understand that the way that we create our hydrogen means something into the air quality and what emissions we are producing. And right now we're producing more emissions than we want to by buying grid power. That is 33% renewable, but it needs to be 100% renewable for us.
On thoughts around that, the emissions profile of the fuel?
That to me?
Yep.
Well, no, I would just say that I think what Lauren just said was brilliant. I think it really, you have to have the end game in mind. We have to realize there are steps to get to that end game. But I do think we have to look at the various technologies really from beginning to end in terms of their environmental impact, and that is incredibly complicated. I do think it sometimes gets lost in the regulatory discussions, but I think it's something that as an industry we do need to continue to lean in on, because all of the technologies have environmental impacts. It's easy to focus on one and ignore another, and if we do that, we're going to miss the boat. But again, ultimately, we have to be focused on that end game of getting to zero emission.
Oh, that's fantastic. And now I'm going to turn to a question for Blair and Cliff that came in through about planning, the stage that you're at in planning. And Cliff, the question came in particular out of something you said about dragging a bus over to Sunline in order to get it fueled up. And then Blair, the fact that you mentioned, you've got all this LRT infrastructure. Presumably there was a thought there about using that infrastructure possibly to support electric buses. And now what happens with everybody staying home? So the question essentially is, what kind of fueling resiliency are you now planning for? Whether it's hydrogen fueling resiliency or it's battery electric resiliency in terms of charging, what are your thoughts at your cities and your planning level where you are right now in terms of building that resiliency if the grid goes down or the hydrogen supply chain gets broken for some reason, wildfires, tornadoes, climate events? What's the resiliency being built out? And so Blair, we'll start with you because you're at the earliest stages of planning compared to the other three. What are the thoughts around charging infrastructure resiliency or hydrogen resiliency in Waterloo?
Yeah, it is one of the challenges we're having. We're trying to figure out how to best do it. Where we have the new garage is right at the edge of town, like many of them are, and the other locations, even the along our LRT line, the charging, we've got major capacity there for the electricity, but we don't have at this point the ability to even tap into that. So we have to look at how we can potentially tap into that. It's because we do have big transformers at a number of transit centers where buses will come in. I've got another terminal being built at the south end that we want to look at, see whether I can put an on-road charger, at least prepare for that. So we've got that bit of resiliency built into the system. And then as we start looking at our other garages, even to plan them, how do we either retrofit or replace them in the long run and create spaces where we would deal with 3 different hydro agencies. So each of them is different in each of our garages, each of our cities. So we've even got to look at how do those overlap, or how do we manage to sort of make sure that we can get the same amount of stuff, but from different agencies that we're going to have to deal with. And I think that is actually one of my next steps, is to figure out at our garage, what are we going to do to, and talk with some of our other staff and our facility staff to figure out how do we make sure that we don't have problems, or how we've sort of got long-term plans. You can put battery storage there so that we can make sure we've got at least some capacity.
Yeah, and Blair, maybe for the sake of our international participants, when you said we have 3 different hydro jurisdictions, I'll note that means utilities, electric utilities, because it comes from hydro. So what that means is essentially, like a lot of jurisdictions around the world, one bus, one route might go through 3 different utility jurisdictions. And how do you plan out for resiliency with that? It's complex, it's difficult, and it's probably not standardized yet, and certainly not. So to that point, maybe Cliff, last word on this question: how are you building out resiliency in Orange County on a fueling or charging perspective?
Well, I could tell you that it takes less electricity to run a hydrogen fuel station operating off of liquid hydrogen. So we have a diesel backup generator. So if power were to go down, we can actually continue to operate our hydrogen fuel cell buses. However, having said that, to your point, the pipeline of LNG right now, it's being trucked in, and that's definitely a concern. With the 10 bus pilot, it's not a big deal now. If the fuel is not delivered, the buses get parked. But for the long term, we'll be looking at steam reformation, and we're definitely going to have to talk to Lauren again on that one and see if that's something that's feasible if we're going to go with an entire fleet. Because I think that the supply of natural gas coming into our bases is probably more reliable than a truck delivering liquid hydrogen. So it's definitely something we have to look at as we go into the future. But just a quick second on those who are pursuing an all electric fleet, it's going to cost. I don't know that there's a backup generator big enough. The biggest I've seen is 1.5 megawatts, and that'll do about 25 buses. So if you have a couple hundred buses, it's going to be a problem. But definitely you can use that for lifeline transit services. So.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Cliff. And we've come to the end of our panel slot, and I really want to thank everybody here. We have a few more questions that we just couldn't get to, but there's a lot of content being shared. I'm getting a lot of comments here basically indicating that this is good knowledge for a number of fleets on the line that are looking to go electric as part of hopefully economic stimulus funding in this country and in the United States and in Europe. So I really want to thank you, Lauren, Doran, Blair, and Cliff, for your insights. I think it is fair to say that of these mid-sized transit systems, we've actually heard more innovation and more flexibility than we frequently hear at some of the larger systems. So thank you for your thoughts, your insights, and I suspect a lot of our participants will be following up with you for more insights post-factum. Thank you, have a great afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you all virtually in our next session.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.